Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so we like to believe human behavior is guided mainly by values, intentions, and, stated principles.
Right. The nodal narratives we tell ourselves.
Exactly. But what if much of social life is actually better explained by incentives, information asymmetry, and hidden self-interest operating just beneath that moral language?
It's a premise that really requires us to take off the rose-colored glasses, for sure.
Big time. Because when you strip away those noble narratives we construct about our own daily choices, you're often left with a pretty stark, invisible architecture of rewards and penalties.
And that architecture is what's actually steering the ship.
And mapping out that hidden architecture is the mission of this deep dive today. We are unpacking a truly paradigm-shifting framework, relying heavily on the work of Stephen D. Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner.
Specifically their book, Freakonomics. A rogue economist explores the hidden side of everything.
Right, Freakonomics. And for you listening, if you're expecting a dry lecture on inflation rates or the gold standard,
You can throw those expectations right out the window.
totally out the window. Because Stephen Levitt is a very unorthodox economist.
Yeah.
I mean, he won the John Bates Clark Medal, which is essentially the Junior Nobel Prize in his field, yet he openly admits he's terrible at math.
Yeah, he avoids calculus entirely.
Right. And if you ask him what the stock market is going to do next week, he'll just shrug and tell you he has absolutely no idea.
Which is funny for an award-winning economist. But his brilliance isn't in macroeconomic forecasting. Levitt approaches the world much more like a forensic investigator.
Yes, exactly.
He takes the rigorous, data-driven tools of economics and points them at the riddles of everyday life. And Stephen Dubner is the brilliant journalist who acts as the translator here.
Because looking at raw data sets is, well, it's boring for most of us.
Very. So Dubner takes Levitt's massive, complex data sets and turns them into compelling narratives. Together, they strip economics down to its most primal, fundamental aim.
Which is explaining how people get what they want.
Or what they need, yeah. Especially when other people want or need the exact same thing.
So we are going to conduct a real systems-level investigation into some wild subjects today. We'll be looking at everything from cheating and sumo wrestling to the actual impact of parenting techniques to the hidden motives of real estate agents.
It's a wide net.
It is. But to start, we really need to look at the design of the system itself. Most of the systems we interact with pretend to be based on transparent public virtue, but they're actually structured around uneven information and institutional roles.
Right.
Which brings us to a foundational question for this whole deep dive. How does the book distinguish between morality and economics?
The distinction is crucial. I mean, it's the bedrock of this entire framework. Morality represents the way we would like the world to work.
The ideal.
Exactly, the ideal. Economics represents how it actually does work. Morality is the stated principle of fairness or goodness. Economics, at least as used in this framework, is the observational science of behavior.
So it requires you to look at a system entirely devoid of wishful thinking.
Yes, you have to ask, what are the actual tangible rewards here? What are the penalties? Who holds the information and who is kept in the dark?
That distinction really makes me think of Adam Smith.
Oh, yeah, the classic example.
Right, because most people hear his name and picture the father of ruthless capitalism, the invisible hand, the ultimate free market guy.
The patron saint of greed is how some people frame him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But his background paints a completely different picture, doesn't it?
Completely. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher long before he was an economist. Decades before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he published a book in 1759 called The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
1759. So we're talking the very dawn of modern capitalism.
Right. He was watching the world shift rapidly around him, and he was obsessed with the friction between our individual, selfish desires and our societal moral norms.
He wanted to understand why, given the opportunity, one person might cheat to get ahead while another absolutely refuses to do so.
Yes. And his conclusion was that to truly judge a situation objectively, we have to mentally step outside of ourselves. We have to become an impartial third-party observer.
And that impartial observer stance is exactly the mindset we need you, the listener, to adopt for this next scenario. I want to jump straight into a real-world application from the sources.
The daycare center.
Yes, the Haifa Daycare Center. So economists looked at a group of daycare centers in Haifa, Israel. The problem was simple. Parents were chronically late picking up their kids at the end of the day.
A nightmare for the teachers.
A total nightmare. The teachers were frustrated, stuck working unpaid overtime, just waiting around.
So the economists assumed a standard economic fix.
Right, they introduced a $3 fine for any parent who was more than 10 minutes late. Now, rationally, you would naturally assume tardiness would drop.
That's what the economists thought.
Instead, the number of late pickups doubled.
Doubled.
Why did a penalty cause the bad behavior to skyrocket?
Because the economists fundamentally misunderstood the existing incentive structure. To understand the failure, we have to look at the three basic flavors of incentives.
Okay, let's break those down.
You have economic, social, and moral incentives. Almost every decision we make involves a combination of these. Take smoking, for example.
Yeah.
A hefty government tax on a pack of cigarettes, that's an economic incentive. The fact that you're forced to stand outside in the freezing rain to smoke because it's banned in restaurants.
That's a social incentive.
Exactly. And the government running ad campaigns saying that purchasing black market cigarettes funds terrorism.
That's a moral incentive.
Precisely.
I'm tracking. So let's apply those flavors to the parents at the daycare center. Before the $3 fine existed, what was keeping the parents on time?
Guilt.
Just guilt.
Pure guilt. Before the fine, the parents were governed by a powerful moral and social incentive. They knew that being late meant they were personally inconveniencing a teacher. They had to look in the eye every single morning.
Right, the walk of shame.
The walk of shame. The moral penalty of guilt and the social penalty of facing an annoyed teacher were actually quite effective at keeping most parents on schedule.
But the moment the daycare center introduced a $3 fine, they altered the entire psychological landscape of the decision.
They replaced a strong moral incentive with a very weak economic one.
Because $3 is nothing. It completely erased the guilt. The parent is no longer thinking, I am a bad person for making the teacher wait.
No, they are thinking, I am buying extra childcare for the incredibly cheap price of $3.
It's a bargain.
It transitioned from a social norm to a market norm. The relationship became transactional. And the fascinating thing about this study is what happened next.
Right, because the economists realized their mistake.
They did. They realized it was backfiring, so they removed the $3 fine. They went back to the original rules.
But the late pickups stayed high.
They stayed completely elevated. Because once you commodify a social relationship, you cannot easily uncommodify it.
The parents had already internalized that late pickups had a price tag.
Yeah.
And even when the price tag was removed, the moral guilt did not return.
The system had been permanently gamed. The social contract was broken.
It's amazing how a tiny tweak in the rules totally rewrites human psychology. But, it's one thing when we're talking about stressed parents gaming a daycare system.
Right.
What happens when the person gaming this system isn't the consumer, but a highly paid professional you've hired to protect you? Let's transition into the incentive structure of experts.
This is where things get uncomfortable.
Very. We rely on experts for everything because the world is just too complex to navigate alone.
And this introduces the core concept of information asymmetry. When you hire a doctor, a lawyer, a mechanic, or a real estate agent, you are hiring them specifically because they possess a massive informational advantage over you.
They know the market, they know the jargon, they know the hidden flaws in the contract.
Exactly. And the foundational assumption of our society is that when you pay an expert, their goal aligns with yours.
I know when I've hired a real estate agent, my assumption is always, we are a team. We both want to sell this house for the absolute highest price possible.
But the data Levitt uncovered completely shatters that illusion of alignment.
Which brings up one of our required questions to tackle. How do incentives explain the behavior of experts like real estate agents?
To answer that, Levitt accessed a massive data set of nearly 100,000 home sales in suburban Chicago.
100,000.
Yes. And the brilliant part of this data set is that out of those homes, over 3,000 were actually owned by the real estate agents themselves.
Ah, that creates the perfect control group.
Exactly. How does an expert execute a service for a client versus how they execute that exact same service for themselves?
And the numbers are staggering. You control for every possible variable: location, age of the house, square footage. When an agent sells their own home, they keep it on the market an average of 10 days longer.
10 days is a long time in real estate.
It is. And they sell it for over 3% more than they would if it were their client's house.
Think about the mechanics of that. On a $300,000 house, 3% is $10,000.
10 grand.
When it's the agent's own money on the line, they are perfectly willing to endure the stress of holding out for an extra week and a half to pocket an additional 10 grand.
But when it is your house, They heavily encourage you to accept the first decent offer that comes across the table.
They do.
Wait, let me break down the math on why they do that, because this is where the hidden incentive really bites. A standard real estate commission is 6%,
Right.
but the agent doesn't get 6%. It's split between the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, leaving 3%.
Then your agent usually has to give half of that to their brokerage firm.
So at the end of the day, your specific agent is only personally pocketing about 1.5% of the total purchase price.
Exactly right. So let's apply that 1.5% to the extra $10,000 they could get you if they worked harder and kept the house on the market longer.
1.5% of $10,000 is...
$150.
Wow, $150. For me, the seller, an extra $10,000 is life-changing money. It pays off a car, it covers tuition.
Though for the agent.
The reward for all that extra work, hosting more open houses, paying for more marketing, dealing with 10 more days of phone calls, is a measly $150. I can see why they don't want to do it. It's simply not worth their time.
Their true economic incentive is volume. It is churning properties. Their goal is to close the deal as quickly as possible, collect their guaranteed thousands, and move on to the next client.
But they can't just tell you that.
Of course not. They have to convince you that taking a lower offer is actually your best move. And how do they achieve that? By weaponizing their informational advantage.
They convert their inside knowledge into fear.
Exactly.
They know you are terrified of your house sitting on the market and becoming stigmatized. So they'll casually mention, oh, the market is softening right now.
Or they'll say, there's a newer build 3 streets over that just dropped its asking price.
Right. They use their authority to generate anxiety, steering you toward a decision that perfectly serves their incentive structure, all while maintaining the appearance of looking out for you.
And this structural phenomenon is everywhere. The sources point to auto mechanics in California.
Oh, the emissions testing.
Yes, a study found that mechanics were frequently passing cars on emissions inspections that absolutely should have failed. Why? Because the mechanics knew that a lenient inspector gets repeat business.
Their economic incentive was customer loyalty and volume,
which entirely overrode the moral or legal incentive of environmental safety.
Or look at the medical field. The data shows that obstetricians operating in areas with declining birth rates are significantly more likely to perform cesarean section deliveries than doctors in areas with booming populations.
Because a C-section is a more complex surgical procedure that commands a much higher fee.
When patient volume drops, the invisible incentive is to increase the revenue per patient. That is deeply unsettling.
It is unsettling, but it makes perfect structural sense. It's vital to frame this correctly, though. Systems analysis doesn't claim these professionals are inherently malicious or evil.
They aren't sitting in a dark room twirling a mustache.
No, they are simply human beings responding rationally to the architecture of reward and constraint that surrounds them. If you design a system where an expert's financial well-being is detached from the optimal outcome of the client, the data will inevitably reflect that detachment.
So if that is how hidden incentives shape individual everyday transactions, what happens when we zoom out? What happens when these invisible forces operate on a massive societal scale over the course of decades?
We start tracing outcomes that seem entirely inexplicable otherwise.
Exactly. Which leads us to what is undoubtedly the most provocative, highly debated section of the source material. We're going to look at how a hidden variable produced a massive, counterintuitive shift in American society.
I know where this is going.
I want to take you back to the early 1990s in the United States. If you were watching the news back then, the conventional wisdom was absolute, unified terror regarding violent crime.
The graphs for violent crime had been pointing up relentlessly for decades, and the experts were convinced the worst was yet to come.
Criminologists, politicians, sociologists, they were all warning of a coming generation of super predators.
A prominent criminologist named James Allen Fox produced a report for the U.S. Attorney General stating that the optimistic scenario was a 15% rise in teen homicides over the next decade.
The optimistic scenario.
Yes. The pessimistic scenario was that the teen murder rate would more than double.
The rhetoric was apocalyptic. The smart money was entirely on blood in the streets. But then, the exact opposite happened.
Instead of skyrocketing, crime plummeted.
It didn't just dip, it fell off a cliff. It dropped in every major category, in every geographic region, across all demographics. The teenage murder rate didn't double. It fell by more than 50% within 5 years.
The experts were completely blindsided.
Naturally, once the drop occurred, those same experts rushed to the podiums to explain it. The conventional wisdom quickly formed around three main pillars.
The booming 90s economy, innovative new policing strategies like the broken windows theory deployed in New York City, and stricter gun control laws.
Those explanations sound perfectly logical.
They are comforting because they suggest that deliberate, recent human policies solved the crisis. We fixed it.
But Levitt and Dubner dug into the data, and the data ruthlessly contradicted those comforting theories. The economy didn't explain why crime dropped among demographics that weren't seeing economic gains.
Right.
The policing strategies didn't explain why crime dropped equally in cities that didn't change their police tactics at all.
Los Angeles didn't use New York's tactics, but their crime dropped just as much.
So, what actually caused it? This brings up a required question for us to address. What is the relationship between legalized abortion and 1990s crime rates?
This is the core of their most controversial argument.
Yes, and before you answer that, I want to pause and offer a very explicit framing note to you, the listener. Neither of us here at Crisis and Perception are taking a political, moral, or ideological side on the issue of abortion.
Absolutely not.
And neither are Levitt and Dubner. The authors are incredibly clear in the text that this analysis is not an endorsement of abortion, nor is it a call for state intervention in human reproduction.
We are impartially reporting on a highly contested empirical claim.
The book uses this purely as a masterclass in uncovering hidden, long-range structural causality.
That framing is essential. Systems analysis requires separating moral judgment from empirical pattern recognition. Levitt and Dubner simply asked, what hidden variable took shape decades earlier that fundamentally altered the demographic makeup of the 1990s?
And the variable they identified was the 1973 Supreme Court ruling, Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion across the entire United States.
Yes.
Okay, I have to stop and process the timeline here. If the ruling happened in 1973, why wouldn't the crime drop happen in the 1980s? Why the 20-year delay?
Because of a concept criminologists call the criminal crime. The vast majority of violent crime is committed by young men between the ages of roughly 18 and 24.
So it's a generational delay.
Exactly. To understand the connection, you have to look at the uncomfortable realities of childhood adversity. Decades of exhaustive sociological studies confirm that a child born into a highly adverse family environment is vastly more likely to become a criminal later in life.
Specifically, growing up in a single-parent household roughly doubles a child's propensity to commit a crime.
So does being born to a teenage mother. Deep childhood poverty is another massive predictor.
The argument is that criminality is not distributed equally at birth. Certain environmental factors drastically increase the statistical odds.
Precisely. Now look at the demographics of the women who were most likely to seek an abortion in the immediate wake of Roe v. Wade.
Prior to legalization, wealthy or middle-class women could often arrange safe, albeit illegal, procedures, or travel to places where it was permitted.
But after 1973, abortion became accessible to poor, unmarried, or teenage women. These are the exact demographics whose children, statistically speaking, were at the highest risk for a criminal future.
So, because of legalized abortion, millions of children who would have been born into those specific high-risk environments were not born.
Yes, and this creates a delayed demographic shockwave. Fast forward to the early 1990s, the first cohort of children born after the 1973 ruling are now hitting their late teens.
They are entering their criminal prime.
But the crime rate suddenly plummets. Why? Levitt argues it's because the pool of potential criminals had literally shrunk. The young men who would have been most likely to drive that predicted super predator crime wave simply did not exist.
Unwantedness leads to high crime. Legalized abortion led to less unwantedness, therefore it led to less crime 20 years later.
That is the structural argument.
It is a staggering claim. But claiming correlation is easy. Proving causality is the hard part. How did Levitt prove this wasn't just a massive historical coincidence?
He used several ingenious layers of data to isolate the variable. First, he looked at the timeline of legalization. 5 states, New York, California, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii, actually legalized abortion at least 2 years before the federal Roe v. Wade ruling.
Okay, so if the theory is correct, the crime drop should have started earlier in those specific states.
And the data confirms it did. Between 1988 and 1994, violent crime in those 5 early legalizing states fell 13% compared to the other 45 states.
That is a massive indicator. The timeline matches perfectly.
He also looked at volume. States with the highest abortion rates in the late 1970s experienced the greatest crime drops in the 1990s. High abortion states saw a roughly 30% drop in crime relative to low abortion states.
30% is huge.
Furthermore, when he analyzed the arrest records, the entire decline in crime was concentrated almost exclusively within the post-Roe age cohort. Older criminals were still committing crimes at the exact same rate.
The drop was entirely demographic.
Entirely.
And to solidify the methodology, the sources provide a reverse case study that is absolutely chilling. We can look at Romania in 1966.
The Ceausescu regime.
Right. The dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, wanted to boost the population to build his socialist utopia. So suddenly and without warning, he declared abortion completely illegal. He banned it. Women were literally subjected to state-mandated pregnancy tests at their workplaces.
And what was the demographic result of that ban? Within 1 year, the Romanian birth rate doubled.
But these children were forced into existence in a society and often into families that could not support them. The country was soon overflowing with impoverished children, many of whom were surrendered to horrific state-run orphanages.
And when that specific generation of children came of age in the 1980s, Romania experienced a massive, devastating spike in violent crime.
It is the exact, tragic inverse of the American data, confirming the structural link between forced childhood adversity and future criminality.
It's an incredibly heavy, complex, structural reality.
It really is.
Yeah.
But what fascinates me just as much as the data itself is the societal reaction to it. During the late 90s, when crime was dropping and every police chief and politician was doing victory laps on the nightly news, how many of them cited a 20-year-old Supreme Court ruling as the cause?
Absolutely zero.
Zero. Which brings us to the concept of explaining persistence. Why do mistaken beliefs endure so stubbornly, even when the data clearly points elsewhere?
The authors borrow a term from the economist John Kenneth Galbraith to explain this: conventional wisdom.
And Galbraith didn't use that term as a compliment.
Not at all. He argued that human beings inherently associate truth with convenience. Complex social behaviors, like a 20-year demographic shift impacting urban crime rates, are mentally exhausting to comprehend.
We don't want to think about the bleak realities of childhood poverty and unwantedness.
Therefore, we cling to narratives that are simple, comfortable, and that reinforce our own sense of control and self-esteem.
We want to believe that putting more cops on the street fixed the problem, because it means the heroes did their job and the system works. But how does this conventional wisdom get manufactured in the first place? The book maps out this incredible feedback loop of misinformation between experts and the media.
It's a symbiotic ecosystem driven entirely by hidden incentives. Think about the economic reality of a journalist in a 24-hour news cycle.
They need clicks, they need viewers.
They need to produce content constantly. They need a jarring quote or a shocking statistic to grab a reader's attention and justify their paycheck. On the other side, you have advocates and experts who desperately need media validation.
They need airtime to secure funding, raise donations, or build political capital.
Exactly.
The sources highlight a guy named Mitch Snyder, an advocate for the homeless in the 1980s who mastered this game. Snyder started going to the press claiming there were 3 million homeless Americans.
3 million.
If you do the math on the population at the time, he was claiming that more than 1 out of every 100 people in the U.S. lived on the street. It was a staggering number.
He even told a college audience that 45 homeless people die every single second.
Wait, 45 a second. If you calculate that out, 45 a second is over 3.8 million people a day.
It's absurd.
That would mean 1.4 billion dead homeless people every year in a country that only had about 225 million people total. Even if he misspoke and meant 1 death every 45 seconds. That's still a third of all deaths in the United States.
The numbers were mathematically absurd on their face.
But the media didn't vet the numbers. They printed them.
Because the number 3 million was shocking, and shock sells papers.
Snyder eventually testified before Congress based on these entirely fabricated statistics. Years later, when pressed hard by a journalist on where he got the 3 million figure, Snyder admitted he just made it up because journalists were constantly hounding him for a specific, quantifiable number, and he knew they wouldn't run the story unless he gave them something massive.
The incentive for the journalist was a sensational headline. The incentive for Snyder was a national platform for his cause. Truth was entirely secondary to the transaction.
And this explains the institutional self-protection we see everywhere. Why didn't the 1990s crime experts credit demographic shifts? Because a police chief's incentive is to secure a bigger budget and get reappointed.
If he says, "My innovative policing lowered the murder rate," he wins.
If he says a Supreme Court ruling from before I took office lowered the murder rate, he gets nothing. There is literally zero economic or political incentive for an institution to acknowledge a structural reality if that reality undermines their own importance.
Exactly. Which brings us to the interconnection of all these systems. We've looked at experts, advocates, and massive demographic trends. But the methodology Levitt and Dubner use isn't just about isolating oddities. It's about showing how these hidden incentives are deeply embedded in the cultural narratives and institutions we interact with daily.
The data reveals the patterns, but it's everywhere. Let's look at cheating.
A fun topic.
We touched on it with the real estate agents, but the book defines cheating not as a moral feeling, but as a primordial economic act, getting more for less.
Cheating happens when the incentive to win or the penalty for losing crosses a critical threshold. It is a rational economic calculation. If the stakes are high enough and the perceived risk of getting caught is low enough, human beings will find a way to circumvent the rules.
And to prove just how universal this is, Levitt looked at what is arguably the most sacred, honor-bound sport on the planet, Japanese sumo wrestling.
If there is any sport wrapped in a narrative of pure virtue, it's sumo.
It's tied to Shinto religion, it's about historical emotion and national pride. You'd think it would be completely immune to corruption.
But if you ignore the cultural reverence and strictly analyze the incentive structure governing a sumo wrestler's life, a completely different picture emerges.
The entirety of a sumo wrestler's existence is dictated by their official ranking on a document called the Banzuke.
The top 66 wrestlers in Japan make up the elite divisions, the Makuchi and the Juryo. If you are in those top tiers, you earn a high salary, you have a massive entourage, you eat the best food, and you are treated like a demigod.
But if you are ranked just outside that elite bubble, say 70th in the world,
your life is miserable. You earn a fraction of the money, you have no status, and you literally have to wake up early to scrub the backs and prepare the meals of the elite wrestlers.
The difference between being ranked 66th and 70th is the difference between royalty and servitude.
It's massive.
So how do you maintain your rank? It all comes down to the official tournaments, the Hanbasho. There are 6 a year. Each wrestler fights 15 bouts, 1 per day. The magic number is 8.
If you finish the tournament with a winning record, 8 wins and 7 losses, your ranking rises, or at least stays stable. If you finish with a losing record, 7 wins and 8 losses, your ranking plummets.
That 8th win is the bright line between promotion and demotion.
The authors calculate that an 8th win is mathematically worth about 4 times as much to a wrestler's ranking as any other victory. The incentive to secure it is massive.
So Levitt analyzed an astonishing data set of 32,000 individual sumo bouts. He focused specifically on the final day of the tournament.
Picture the scenario. It's day 15. A wrestler steps into the ring who is completely desperate. He has a 7-7 record. He is on the bubble. He needs this win to stay in the elite division.
And he is facing an opponent who already has an 8-6 record.
The 8-6 wrestler has already secured his elite status. This final match means very little to his overall standing.
Based on an analysis of all their past matchups against each other, the 7-7 wrestler statistically should win about 48.7% of the time. They are roughly evenly matched.
But when Levitt looked at the actual outcomes of these specific high-stakes matches on the final day, the data was shocking.
The 7-7 wrestler doesn't win 48% of the time. He wins almost 80% of the time.
An 80% win rate. That is an absurd statistical anomaly.
Now, the defenders of sumo argued that the 7-7 wrestler simply fights harder because his back is against the wall, the power of motivation.
But Levitt's data didn't stop there. He looked at what happened the next time those same 2 wrestlers met in a subsequent tournament, when the stakes weren't do or die.
Mysteriously, the wrestler who miraculously won that crucial 7-7 match suddenly has a vastly lower winning percentage against that exact same opponent.
The data strongly, almost undeniably, suggests implicit collusion, a quid pro quo.
The arrangement is unspoken but clear. You let me win today so I can keep my rank and my salary, and I will take a dive for you in the next tournament.
The economic incentive to secure that 8th win is so overwhelmingly high that collusion occurs systemically, even in a sport defined by honor. When the Japanese media caught wind of this study, there was absolute outrage.
It destroyed the conventional wisdom of the sport. The economics overrode the morality.
It's a perfect example of systems thinking revealing what surface appearances hide.
Now let's take this same analytical lens and apply it to a system that is deeply personal and fraught with anxiety for many listeners: parenting and education.
Oh, this is the ultimate minefield of conventional wisdom.
Mm.
Parents are bombarded with advice. We play Mozart in the womb. We buy baby Einstein videos. We obsess over which preschool will guarantee our kid gets into Harvard.
But how much do those specific parenting techniques actually matter?
To answer that, the book introduces a statistical tool called regression analysis. It's a way to tease out true causality from a massive, noisy sea of data.
Can you walk us through an ELI 5 and explain it like I'm 5 on how regression analysis actually works in this context?
Sure. Imagine converting thousands of school children into a giant, complex circuit board. Each child has dozens of switches flipped in different directions representing their life circumstances.
Okay, switches.
One switch is their math score. Another is their mother's education level. Another is the number of books in their home. Another is whether they have an intact family.
Got it.
Regression analysis allows a researcher to isolate a single variable by lining up children who are identical in every way except for one switch.
Okay, so imagine Kid A and Kid B. They both live in the same zip code. They both have parents who earn $100,000 a year. Both sets of parents have master's degrees.
Every single switch on the board is identical, except Kid A has 100 children's books in their house, and Kid B has 0 books.
Precisely. By holding all those other variables constant, you can look at their test scores and isolate the true standalone impact of having books in the home.
The authors applied this technique to a massive data set from the U.S. Department of Education called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, or the ECLS. It tracked over 20,000 children from kindergarten through 5th grade.
So what did the regression analysis reveal about the books? Because if you just look at raw data, kids with a lot of books in the house test way higher than kids without books. The conventional wisdom is buy a ton of books, make your kids smarter.
But regression analysis exposes the difference between correlation and causality. When Levitt isolated the variables, he found that the physical presence of paper and ink in the house did absolutely nothing to raise a child's test scores.
Nothing.
Nothing. The books are a correlation. What the data showed was that parents who buy lots of books tend to be highly educated and have a higher socioeconomic status. The books are a proxy, a symptom of a household that inherently values education.
It's not the books. It's the parents who buy the books. In fact, Levitt lists an entire set of ECLS data points that perfectly illustrate this. When you run the numbers, what actually correlates with high test scores?
Things like having highly educated parents,
Having a mother who was 30 or older when her first child was born.
having low birth weight, which actually correlates negatively, and having parents who speak English in the home.
Notice a pattern there. Those are all traits that describe who the parents are as individuals and what their inherent life circumstances are.
Now look at the list of things that the ECLS data says do not correlate with higher test scores.
Having an intact family,
Moving to a better neighborhood,
having a mother who stayed home between birth and kindergarten.
attending Head Start, taking your kids to museums, or watching TV.
Those are all things parents do. The data strongly suggests that by the time a child is born, the die is largely cast regarding their academic potential, based on the inherent traits of the parents.
Anxious, hyper-intensive parenting interventions, like dragging a toddler to a museum every weekend or buying a library of encyclopedias, are generally ineffective at fundamentally altering the child's academic trajectory.
It shatters the illusion of control. We want to believe that our daily actions as parents are the sole architects of our children's success, because it gives us a sense of agency.
But the system is driven by deeper structural demographics.
Which brings us to a final crucial point about how these systems function: the power of information. We've spent this whole time talking about how information asymmetry allows experts to exploit us, or allows narratives to persist.
But the internet is fundamentally changing this architecture. The internet acts as a massive equalizer against the structural advantage of the expert.
Let's return to the real estate agents. Remember the massive informational advantage they had in the 1990s when Levitt ran that initial Chicago study?
They controlled the multiple listing service. You literally couldn't see what houses were for sale without them.
But today, anyone can pull out their phone, open Zillow or Redfin, and instantly see the historical price of a house, the property taxes, the neighborhood comps, and how long it's been on the market.
The asymmetry is collapsing, and the data reflects that collapse. Recent studies show that because buyers and sellers have so much more access to data, the gap between how an agent sells their own home versus a client's home has shrunk by 1/3.
When information is democratized, the hidden incentive loses its power to exploit.
But when information remains fiercely hidden, the exploitation can be catastrophic. The sources briefly point to the Enron scandal as the ultimate example of an information crime.
Enron wasn't just an accounting fraud, it was a weaponization of asymmetry. They disguised massive debt in off-book partnerships, and they manipulated energy markets in California because they held all the operational data.
The Enron tapes are a chilling testament to hidden incentives. You have secretly recorded conversations of Enron traders literally cheering on a forest fire in California, chanting, "Burn, baby, burn."
Because the fire threatened transmission lines, which would allow Enron to jack up the price of electricity even further.
There's another tape where a trader mocks a theoretical Grandma Millie who wants her money back after Enron intentionally jammed power prices up to $250 a megawatt hour.
When the curtain is pulled back and the hidden information is finally revealed, you see the pure, ruthless incentive structure laid bare. It has nothing to do with morality or public service. It's pure extraction.
Which brings our entire conversation full circle. Understanding these systems, learning to look past the stated intentions and dig into the actual structural incentives is not just a neat academic trick.
It is a necessary defense mechanism for navigating modern society. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from the daycare centers of Haifa to the commission splits of Chicago real estate agents.
We've looked at the massive delayed demographic impacts on the 1990s crime drop,
The feedback loops of media misinformation, the hidden collusion in sumo wrestling, and the data-driven realities of parenting. So it is time to ask the ultimate question of this show. Based on everything we've unpacked, what is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is that we are constantly encouraged by the media, by our institutions, and by our own deep psychological need for comfort to interpret social reality through the lens of appearances, stated intentions, and moral language.
We judge a system by what the people running it say they are trying to achieve.
Meanwhile, the structural role of hidden incentives, information asymmetry, and demographic momentum remains entirely obscured from our view.
We focus our outrage on the morality of the parents arriving late to the daycare instead of recognizing the flawed economic transaction of the $3 fine.
We focus on the friendly smile and the firm handshake of the real estate agent, completely ignoring the 1.5% commission structure that is actually driving their advice.
Precisely. Now, it is important to state that this systems analysis does not erase morality. Morality is still essential. It remains how we want the world to be.
But the crisis is our failure to recognize that human behavior on a macro scale is shaped far less by high-minded ideals than by the invisible architecture of reward and constraint.
When we stop obsessing over intentions and start rigorously understanding the incentives, the seemingly inexplicable chaos of the world suddenly snaps into focus.
The chaos makes structural sense.
It's about swapping our primary lens from a purely moral one to a structural one. And as we reflect on this journey today, I want to emphasize to you, the listener, how to apply this moving forward. You must learn to favor systems over anecdotes.
Mitch Snyder's claim of 3 million homeless people was a terrifying anecdote. The 20-year demographic data behind the 1990s crime drop was a system.
You must favor incentives over appearances. The cultural honor of the sumo wrestler is an appearance. The massive financial value of securing that 8th win is the incentive. And you must favor structural analysis over comforting narratives.
The world is infinitely complex, and it is mentally exhausting to comprehend. But if you rely on better tools, if you insist on measuring, verifying, and looking for the hidden variables, you can see clearly through the obfuscation.
Which leaves you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've spent this time analyzing how experts, advocates, and massive institutions are constantly responding to hidden incentives.
So I ask you to turn that lens inward.
What invisible incentives are shaping your own daily decisions? At your job, in your household, in your relationships? What is the hidden architecture driving your behavior when no one is looking? Once again, we want to credit Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner for their brilliant work.
We highly encourage you to read Freakonomics or borrow it from your local library. It will fundamentally change how you see the world.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.